Hello, my dear students, and welcome back to our fun read. Today I'm going to be reading to you chapter 12, 13, 14, and 15. So 4 more chapters of our book. We last left off with Grant having something in his hand. And that actually makes sense because the name of this chapter, for chapter 12, is Showing Your Hand. "What's that?" asked George. He looked down at the sketch scrawled in ink on the palm of Grant's hand. "It's how I think the bad guys would do it," said Grant. "See, here is a clock tower, the stairs in the top. It would be easy to get up there and plant a bomb and set wires or a timer or whatever you do, and then escape and set it off in the distance with a cell phone or something. Then kaboom!" No one liked the sound of that, but no one said a word. Finally, Christina said, "Well, what do you suggest we do?" "Go up and see it," said Grant. "I have a better idea," said George. The kids just stared at him, so he continued. "Since the bad guys are following us, why don't we follow them and see what they're up to?" Maggie looked aggravated. "Because we don't know where they are," she said, having to hold her tongue and not add the word stupid. George just smiled at them. We just might have a chance to find out where they are." "How?" Grant asked eagerly. George nodded back towards his grandfather, still sitting on the bench. "Granddad has a visitor." The children spun around on the grass and saw the Scotland Yard detective standing over Mr. Bryan. They were talking animatedly. The detective was waving a piece of paper around. Without a word, the kids slowly slid up and sat on a bench behind the adults. They pretended that they were not paying a bit of attention to them, but in fact, they were eavesdropping so hard their ears hurt. "We've heard the Globe, Pedactyles Circus, Madame Thusta's, Cleopatra's Needle, St. Paul's Cathedral, and even the Palace," they overheard him say. He waved a piece of paper in the air. "Are you certain that those children cannot tell us anything else?" Christina noticed a bulge underneath the detective's coat. She figured it was a gun. Mr. Bryan held his hand above his eyes, shielding them from the bright sun. He could not see the kids. Indeed, he must have felt like he was under interrogation. The detective sounded so desperate and determined. "I'm certain those kids don't know anything else," Mr. Bryan assured the detective. He sounded just as determined. At last the detective shook his head and shook hands with Mr. Bryan. "Please call the Yard if you think of anything," he dejected. He turned on his heels, spraying blades of grass, and stalked off, wadding up his list into a ball and tossing it on the ground in disgust. Mr. Bryan looked across the yard for the kids, but he could not spot them because they were behind the bench. Beneath the bench was a piece of paper that the detective had discarded. Christina put her finger to her lips to indicate shh. Then she snaked her arm beneath the bench and picked up the note right by Maggie and George's granddad's foot. Later that night, back at the hotel, the kids had no way to communicate with each other except via instant message on the computer. Christina began. "Maggie, can we get together early tomorrow?" Christina. "Sure. We are out of school. Granddad said we could ride the bus again with Cousin Gilbert." "Oh boy, that's a stroke of good luck." "What should we do?" "Trust Grant's instincts. We don't want to do anything to happen to Big Ben, and we sure don't want it to be bombed." "But it's so dangerous." I know. I'll see you tomorrow." Later that night, Christina transferred the pictures from her digital camera on her computer. The first 2 shots showed parts of the 2 men, both wearing shaggy brown hair, and she noticed that, similar to the cop from earlier, they might have guns underneath their jackets. But both from the back, so she could not see their faces. To keep the fear factor down, she decided not to tell the others. Chapter 13, Pterodactyl Circus. The next day proved to be the busiest Christina had ever known. Maggie and George showed up early, holding big red bus passes for 4. Grant had the list. Christina had her camera, and George had an iPod filled of Beatles music, which he was listening to and dancing to, and looked silly because no one else could hear the music. Mimi had to write. Papa had to run, meet the Queen errands, and had given them the lecture about behaving and staying out of trouble. Mr. Bryan had attended the editorial meeting. When they boarded the first bus, Cousin Gilbert just waved. The kids waved back and sat on the upper deck far away from Gilbert as much as possible. But that wasn't necessary. Gilbert was too preoccupied with other things. So Gilbert's like a teenager. He's kind of like off doing his own stuff. Christina thought it was a great fun ride, so high up to see all the sights. London was so busy in the morning. People were heading to work, tourists were everywhere, kids were on school holidays, so they were out and about too. Traffic was snarled, horns blared, sirens screeched. It was the big city bustle that Christina and Mimi loved. First off, Pterodactyl Circus, shouted Grant, spotting the sign. The kids scampered down the staircase and off to the back of the bus. Gilbert never even looked. The kids had decided that the detectives' list suggested other possible places for disaster. They thought that if they could visit each place, then they might eliminate Big Ben from the hit list, and maybe even spy on the bad guys somewhere, even though Christina was not too thrilled about that idea. As soon as they hit the sidewalk, Grant spun around and around. Okay, where is it? Where's the circus? He asked. Maggie and George laughed. This is the circus, they said in unison. Grant and Christina looked at each other, puzzled. Then where is the big top tent? Asked Grant. And the elephants, and the clowns, and the cotton candy, Christina joined in. Maggie and George just sighed, as if they had to explain all this before to a former tourist. Pterodactyl Circus is just a place, Maggie began. Where you come from to head for cinemas or the theater, finished George. Sort of like your Times Square in New York City. Grant just shrugged in disappointment. Well, we might as well look around, said Christina, waving her arms in the endless array of enormous neon signs. This would be a good place to set off a bomb if you were a bad guy, I guess. I mean, there are lots of people around. No, Grant argued. It's Big Ben. We could stand here all day, Maggie said, or we could move on to the next place. Hey, who's that dude? Grant interrupted. The others thought he might have spied one of the bad guys and turned this way and that way, looking all around. Finally, Maggie realized what Grant meant. It was a statue nearby. That's Eros, she said. That's the Greek god of love. You know, from Greek mythology. Oh, barf bags, bleh, said Grant, grabbing his waist and bending over to get a better view. He'd better keep that Cupid's arrow away from us, right, George? George blushed. Christina giggled. Grant, it's an English name, she explained, but Grant just parted off the bus stop without them, and they had to hurry up and catch the bus to St. Paul's Cathedral. In their rush, they failed to notice 2 men crammed into one of London's bright red phone booths, pretending to make a phone call. Now it was Christina's turn to be astounded. Wow, what a church, she said, as she put her hands on her waist and bent back to stare up at it. It was a beautiful St. Paul's Cathedral. This is what Mimi would call amazing. This is one of London's main tourist attractions, Maggie explained. The cathedral is famous. It was designed by a famous architect, Christopher Wren. It was destroyed during the 1666 Great Fire of London, and then it was destroyed again during World War II. And people tried to throw a lot of water on the dome to keep it from burning, from the bombs that the German airplanes were dropping on it. Bombs, 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 Grant grumbled. Never heard so much about that word since the World Trade Center attacks. Christina put her arms around her little brother. Don't be discouraged, Grant, she said. There have always been bad people, but they never went out in the end. And this cathedral is proof. So I wanted to take a moment and talk about something. This book can get pretty serious at times, and it keeps referencing an event we talked about earlier this year, which is 9/11. So the terrorist attacks in the United States. And it's kind of connecting it to stuff that's happened in England, in their national historic landmarks. So the main getaway from this is actually something I always say in class. Even though some parts of history may seem really bad and really gruesome, we learn from the history to make everything better, to make the world a better place. So these are real events. Some of this stuff is real events that's happened. These are actual places that these kids are going in the world. And so learning from this history is very important. The gigantic building with its dome towers was very impressive, but it was even more impressive inside in the beautiful sanctuary. It has flying buttresses, said George, as they all stood beneath the grand dome and looked up so far it made them dizzy. Flying what? Grant asked, but George ignored him. Come on, George said instead. We'll show you our favorite place, the Whispering Gallery. Maggie nodded eagerly. Grant and Christina had scampered along behind their friends at a rapid pace to keep up. Soon they were indeed going up, and up, and up the endless circular staircase, until they had finally reached a balcony high up in the dome. Wow, Christina said. This is a great view. True, said Maggie. But what's famous about this gallery is its acoustics. You can whisper and hear one another from anywhere along the balcony. To prove her point, she headed for the far side of the gallery. Grant and George moved away as well, and Christina stayed where she was. Everyone was in position. Maggie whispered, Can you hear me? Christina giggled. She could indeed hear Maggie, and from across the expanse of the dome, Maggie giggled because she could hear Christina giggle. And then they both stopped abruptly when some of the adults gave them mean, this is a church, you know, look. Next, Grant piped in. Do you see what I see? He asked so loudly there was more mean looks from the other tourist. Grant, whisper. But look, he said, not so loud. The other kids stared down the balcony onto the floor of the cathedral. What? Christina whispered. Shh, said a tourist. Where? George whispered. Shh, said a different tourist. Who? Whispered Maggie. Shh, said all three tourists. Quickly the kids looked where Grant pointed. Two dark, bushy-haired men with backpacks stood near the column down on the cathedral floor. They seemed to be looking for a note. Just as quickly, the four kids scampered back down the spiraling staircase, but by the time they had reached the bottom, the men had disappeared. However, at the bottom of the column was a folded piece of paper. Grant ran over and picked it up. It was just an informational brochure about St. Paul's. Grant hastily scanned the smooth white column for any sketches that had been drawn on it, but he found nothing. What do we do now? Said Christina. Pray? Asked Maggie. Chapter 14. Cleopatra's Needle. The kids stood back outside in the sunshine. The presumed bad guys were nowhere to be seen. Of course, looking for them in St. Paul's is like looking for a needle in a haystack, George grumbled. Hey, I forgot. Cleopatra's Needle was one of the places on the detective's list, Maggie reminded them. If we catch the bus, we can get there. No, George disagreed. We'll have to change buses. Let's take the tube, it's faster. The tube? Asked Grant, hopefully. Is it like a water park tube or a amusement park tube? Maggie Grant laughed. No, Grant. We mean the London Underground, what you guys call subway in New York City. Well, that's cool too, Grant said. Let's go. Maggie quickly checked the list of underground routes posted nearby. We can take the circle, she said. Follow me. And before the others could object, Maggie sped off. The rest of the kids followed her down some stairs by the red and blue circular underground sign. Maggie bought tickets from the automatic machine, and the others copied her by feeding their tickets into another machine, which admitted them onto the platform. Christina laughed out loud. It's such a zoo. People are scrambling everywhere, and everyone seemed to know where they were going, except for her. She just hoped that Maggie knew what she was doing. What does mind the gap mean? Grant asked, as Christina grabbed him by the back of his t-shirt before he fell into the opening of the train tracks beneath the platform and the trains. Maggie and George laughed. That's what it means, George said. Watch out or you're going to end up under the train instead of on it. Christina shuddered and held Grant's hand, even though he squirmed like mad, until the train was coming their way, stopped, and the doors swished open, and the kids clambered aboard. It seemed like they could sit down and it seemed like before they could sit down or get comfortable, that Maggie was squealing, "Get off of here!" And the kids tumbled out of the train, minding the gap, and onto another platform. Up the steps she sped, and the others racing to keep up. As the four kids spewed out of the underground station, the bright sunlight temporarily blinded them. I see them, George screamed, racing ahead. I can't see anything, Christina complained, shielding her eyes from the sun. It isn't them, said Grant, pointing to the two boys up ahead. False alarm. George was aggravated. How do you know? He said grumpily. Just 'cause you didn't see them first. No, Grant promised, sticking his Boy Scout fingers up. I could just tell. Wow, said Christina. Look around. When you actually start looking, there's lots and lots of tall guys in dark clothing with long dark hair wearing backpack. I guess they're all students? Probably, said Maggie. That's the way the Gilbert dresses when he goes to school and not driving the bus. We're not looking for students, Grant groused. We're looking for mean people, and I'll know 'em when I see 'em. Dispirited, the kids trudged towards the monument where they were seeking Cleopatra's Needle. When they came upon it, Christina was enthralled, as she always was with anything Egyptian. The tall, pink stone obelisk looked very old. In fact, the plaque nearby said it was much older than the city of London. It was created in 15 BCE, or 1500 BCE. Can you read hieroglyphics? George asked Christina. No, but Grant can, Christina answered. Really? Asked Maggie in disbelief. George shrugged his shoulders. Sure, he said, as if it were easy and every kid could read ancient Egyptian writing. He stared at all the mysterious faded markings and then shook his head forlorningly. Oh, said George, misinterpreting Grant's somber look. Does it say something awful? Grant pursed his lips together and nodded his head slowly up and down. Terrifying? Asked Maggie, her voice almost trembling. Really? Asked Christina, not fooled by her brother's play acting. It says, I'm starving, Grant hollered out. And I can't solve a mystery when my tummy is rumbling louder than a mummy. Mummies don't talk, George argued, not appreciating Grant's shenanigans. Oh, Grant, said Maggie, you're too silly. I agree. Let's pop into this pub for a bite to eat, and maybe we can think straighter. In the dark pub, the kids pulled heavy chairs up from the large round table. The waitress and the jester, lost my page, type outfit took their order, and soon they were munching on hot fish with lemony tartar sauce. I thought they said we were getting chips, said Grant. Those are chips, George said, pointing to George Grant's plate. We all have them. Those are French fries, Grant argued, popping one, dipping it in ketchup and into his mouth. Maggie laughed. You call them French fries, but we call them chips. Christina wiped her mouth from the root beer foam. Communication. Maybe that's what this is all about. What do you mean? Asked Maggie. Christina looked thoughtful. We are running around on a wild goose chase. We just don't have enough information. We are just guessing. We really need another clue to help us along. Well, I don't have a clue as to how to get another clue, said Grant grumpily. Maggie nodded sympathetically. The only thing we have to go on right now is a detective list. There are still some places that we have not visited. Perhaps we should just stick to our knitting and see where it gets us. What choice do we have? The others agreed, finishing their lunches so they could head back out. When Maggie said, I'll be just a minute. I need to spend a penny. She hopped up and left the table. Grant watched her go as if she were crazy. What's she going to spend a penny on? George giggled. That's just an expression. It means she has to go to the bathroom, or what we call the loo. Grant shook his head. Then why didn't she just say that? Christina giggled. She did. She told her brother. Then muttered to herself, communication indeed. Chapter 15. To be or not to be. Back outside, the kids decided to ride up to the Thames River to the Globe Theatre, one of the places on the detective's list. The Globe Theatre seems to be an odd place to be on a list of possible places to bomb, said Christina, as they stood on the ticket queue. Yes, George agreed. What does it have in common with Big Ben, St. Paul's, and other places like that? I guess it's just another famous London area location that would make the headlines if it were to be blown up, Maggie guessed. It should make world headlines, Grant said, as he twirled around and around a sign pole. And why is that, Grant? Asked Christina. She just knew her brother would have something silly answer to say. Because all the world's stage, he intoned in a deep actor's voice, quoting Shakespeare. He was disappointed when the other kids did not fall over laughing. Instead, they wore serious frowns on their face. You could be sadly right, Maggie moaned, then added, Come on, the boat's here. The children scampered aboard the flat-bottomed boat for their tour up the Thames River. Christina and Grant had grown up around boats and loved being in the water. Mimi and Papa often took them to Bath, North Carolina, named after Bath, England, to ride the ferry boats that ran between the outer banks. That was where Blackbeard, as the fiercest pirate of them all, had come from England. They also boated on the intercoastal waterway around Savannah, Georgia. This is so much fun, Christina said. She liked that there was so much to look at on each side of the water, or river. She wished the big river ran through their town back home. She could just imagine merry old England back when it was new, bustling port town. Perhaps Sir Walter Raleigh had sailed to America from these very waters. We learned about Sir Walter Raleigh this year, just saying. Oops, she thought, remembering her 4th grade social studies. Sir Walter Raleigh never came to the New World. Maybe we could just pop in the water for a swim, suggested Grant. beginning to cobble together some typical English phrases. Ew, whined Maggie and George together. And maybe we could die of plague, George added. You mean the water's that polluted? Christina asked, astounded. She hated pollution and litter. Those were her two pet peeves. The Black Death once killed thousands in London, Maggie reminded them. Rats spread the plague, George said, cringing. Christina shivered. She hated anything creepy crawly. She couldn't help it. But rats? They were the worst. I avoided rats like the plague, she swore to the others. Have you actually seen a rat? Asked George. Christina thought hard. Well, maybe only a mouse. But that was close enough for me. You want to see a wharf rat? George asked mischievously. I do, Grant cried eagerly. Then just look right over there, George said, pointing towards the thick lines tied between the battered old wharf and the rusty hulk of an abandoned ship. Everyone turned to look, and sure enough, there was a large rat climbing the rope, like an acrobatic. He dipped into the water from his hair and his long tail, and seemed to stop to stare back at them before he vanished into the ship's scupper. Yikes, cried Christina. I'm not getting on that boat. And then she began to hop on one foot and then the other, looking around beneath the seat, satisfied that there was nothing more than just some leftover candy bar wrappers. She shoved her feet beneath her on the seat, just to be safe. The others laughed. Don't be a scaredy cat, George said. I'd be a scaredy cat of a rat that big, even if I were a big rat-eating cat, Christina admitted, and the kids laughed. Then the foursome settled down to admire a more pleasant scenery along the way. Lovely riverside gardens, quaint pubs with funny names like Ye Old Eel House, Castle Spirals, Roman Arrow Walls, and much more. Soon the boatman called, The Globe! And the kids stammered down the gangplank to the dock. Christina serendipitously took a peek to make sure there was no more rats running beneath her feet. Maggie was back to her tour guide mode. William Shakespeare was the world's most famous playwright. He not only wrote the famous plays like Romeo and Juliet and Macbeth, he acted in plays too. He had a large family, and the Globe was the one theater where his plays were performed. Sometimes rich people sent their servants to stand in line to buy tickets for them. If you paid a certain price, you could sit close to the stage, and even tease the actors or tickle them with straw. Women weren't allowed to be actors, so men had to play the women parts, too. Not me, swore Grant. Methinks a no, no, no. Well, now that we're here, what do we look for? Asked Christina. Anything suspicious? Suggested George. Anything that looks like that, Grant said. And sure enough, he pointed to two men with backpacks reading a posted notice of an audition. Long, scraggy hair hung down over their backpacks. Quietly, the kids snuck closer and closer until they were right behind the suspicious characters. Suddenly, the two men turned around and screamed at the kids. Getteth away from us! The four kids screamed at the top of their lungs and ran far and fast as they could back to the boat. And that is the end of chapter 15 and the end of our fun read today. This is probably one of the longest ones. It almost went on for 30 minutes. But I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.